All right, we're going to be reading chapter 3 of Soldier's Heart, and it is called Towards Manassas. He thought he would remember that train ride forever. Most of the men had never been on a train, and certainly few of them had been on one quite so plush. The seats were soft and cushiony, and the food, especially compared to that rough fare at Fort Snelling, was delicious. They rode across Wisconsin and down into Chicago, and everywhere they stopped, there were huge crowds gathering to cheer them on. Girls gave them hankies and sweets, and Charlie figured later he'd fallen in love at least a dozen times. The country didn't change much at first. It was all still Union. They made their way, sleeping like lords and eating like kings, Charlie thought, across Illinois, down through Indiana, across Ohio, Pennsylvania, and down on towards Maryland. There were crowds all along the way, even when the train didn't stop. Charlie saw his first coloreds when they moved into Maryland. They looked poor, they had poor clothes, and he thought about slavery then, and how it must be strange to own a person, so they had to do what you wanted them to do. He'd never considered it before, and wondered what would happen after the war when the Union had whipped the rebels. Would they be allowed to keep their slaves? The war wasn't about slavery. The troops were going to stop those lawbreakers and those wrong thinkers that were trying to bust up our Union. They talked about it at night while the train moved east and south, and never did they speak of slavery. Just about the wrong-headedness of all those Southern crackers and how they had to teach Johnny Reb a lesson. So Johnny Reb is going to be the nickname for Southerners. A woman of color came up to him when the train was stopped in Maryland, just before Baltimore, and handed him a sweet roll and said to him, "Thank you for what you're doing. I hope God keeps you safe from harm and brings you back to your family." She was crying. Charlie thanked her and ate the cake and smiled at her and wondered why she was crying and wanted to ask why she was glad he was fighting for the South. She was, after all, part of the South. But they had to reboard the train then, and he never found out why the colored woman was crying. He did see, as the train moved off, that a white woman came out of the house and had grabbed the colored woman by her dress and dragged her back inside. Then she had turned and shook her fist at the train. "Oh, she's a Reb," he thought. And it surprised him. They didn't know why he should be surprised that a woman who owned another person would be a rebel. They were in Maryland, of course, and had been warned to watch out for rebels and their sympathizers. But it was still his first experience with a Southerner. He watched the house from the open window as the train pulled away, hoping for another sight of the colored woman. Now the country was changing. There had been farms all along and towns, but now the trees seemed more spaced out. The pastures were more open, and Charlie began to see poor farms. He'd heard the men talking about them, poor whites, but he still wasn't quite ready for the sight when the train slowed for a hill and passed a shack that was little more than boards tacked to some poles. The children running around front were only half clothed, and a man and woman were sitting on the porch in rags. All the soldiers talked about the poor white trash and how these were the people that had come to fight. People who couldn't even get their own yards together. People who had no money, let alone could fight a proper army. It made him very conscious of his own home. Even without having a father there, the house was in good shape. It was kept up, and there was a well-tended garden. They had good food, clothes that covered all of their bodies. He wondered how the rebels thought that they could fight a war when their people couldn't even dress themselves. It made him sad to see the children barely clothed. What would happen to them in the winter, he thought. Now, he knew they didn't have much of a winter here, nothing like Minnesota, but it would still be cold. He turned from the window just as a man next to him, a private named Swenson, said, "You could throw a cat through their house without even hitting the wall." "They don't have anything," Charlie said. "Not a thing." The man nodded. "This ain't going to be much of a war. I don't see how those people can fight. They don't even have any clothes." "Heck, it'll probably be over before we even get to Washington," Swenson said. Charlie nodded but stopped talking because he didn't like profanity, even of the low order, and there was much of it around him. He thought of a surgeon who had spoken to them and told them to try and clean their clothing going into battle. Make sure it's clean before they get hit by a rifle ball. If the cloth was carried into the wound, clean cloth would cause less infection. He thought of it and taken a bullet from one of the paper cartridges and pushed it up against his sleeve. It didn't seem possible that a bullet could go through the sleeve and then into him. Into him? carrying the fabric with it? He thought it must be the same with profanity, bad words, immoral thinking. Charlie believed in heaven and hell and God and Jesus and the devil, and he wanted to be with God if he got killed. If he had profane thoughts as he went into war, they might infect his soul like the dirty clothes would infect his wound. And while he did not think that he would die, did not think that he would even be hit or hurt, really didn't think about it at all. Still, it was best to be careful. He would keep his mind pure. He stared out the window and thought of all the things he would tell his mother and his brother Orrin when he wrote the next letter. I'm a man now, he would write, seeing and doing a man's thing out in the world. I've seen things you wouldn't even believe. He leaned back and closed his eyes and let the gentle rocking of the train take him to sleep. Something interesting in this chapter is they're talking about the poor whites, right? And we talked about how only 25% of the South owned plantations. So that leaves the rest of the South as really quite poor farmers. The level of poverty in many of those areas of the South was even more so than many of those farms in the North. However, it could be very comparable to the cities in the North. Remember, this is a boy from the backcountry of Minnesota. He's never really been to the city, even in his own areas. And the cities, due to industrialization, are very, very poor. Many of the areas, the slum areas where many of the immigrants are coming in, where many of the Southerners that are traveling into the North, and then many of the poor farmers in the North, remember, are being pushed into the cities to go and find those factory jobs. So it wasn't that there were more poor in the South, that these men are not really understanding, is that the North had its poverty as well. It just really wasn't on the farm areas. Farms were really successful in much of the Midwest, which is where Charlie is from. So also, of course, his first time seeing an African-American person. Remember, much of the people in the North had never even experienced this. Slavery isn't even something that they really think about. It's something, oh, yeah, they do in the South. They don't have televisions to see it. Even when the media is writing about it in a newspaper, it's all just something that's written down. So this whole idea of actually seeing this for the first time was very surprising. And it's interesting that Charlie says he'd never really even thought about it before. So here we are going into what today we think of as the war on slavery, right? That this whole idea is this is how slavery ended. The South is fighting to keep their property and their way of life. And here we've got somebody going to fight that war, a true character saying, I've never even thought about slavery. So it's just interesting. Interesting when we're looking at a person in the time period, looking back from a history perspective, that they see things very differently than we see them today. All right, thanks guys. See you later.